Hello, I'm Crystal Petry, and you are watching another episode of 60 Minutes With. On this week's episode, we are talking about how to write a book. If you are thinking about writing a book or have written a book, you're in the process of writing a book, this podcast is for you. We're going to touch on every subject, how many chapters you need to write, even how many words you need to write. And here to educate us on all things writing a book, the author himself, Matt Ley. So welcome to the podcast, Matt.
Thanks, Crystal. That's a very audacious intro. I will do my best as someone who's in the process of the book writing. I'll share the tidbits I've got from the insider's view, but there's so much more than I have. But I'll at least get you started.
Thank you, and my listeners and my audience, thank you as well. Yeah. So, where in the world are you, Matt?
I'm in Kenosha, Wisconsin, so roughly halfway between Milwaukee and Chicago, right on the border.
Perfect. Okay, so my first question, I feel like maybe is an obvious question, but it's a very broad question. How do you write a book?
That's a great question, and one I thought I had a pretty simple answer to when I started. It's a little bit more, it's set out as a process, but it's a bit more complicated than just sitting down and putting pen to paper. And there's definitely people that can do that, but when you are looking to consistently get the book finished, it's a multi-step process. You don't actually write a book. You write a manuscript. And what that is just develop, push it out, get all the words on paper. Then you rewrite a manuscript into a final draft, which goes in front of an editor for revisions. And so then you rewrite the revision. That goes into copy editing, which cleans it up. Then it goes to typesetting to put it into a book format. So there's multiple steps that go in from blank page to something someone else consumes that you would call a book. And I think the biggest step is that I didn't get the first time around is that manuscript. My manuscript was about 55,000 words. My final book was 60,000 words. And you think, oh, you just wrote another 5,000 words in between. No, I deleted about 30,000 words and wrote about 5,000 words because the manuscript, we're really good. We're wired people to be more critical of something that's in front of us versus creative of something that doesn't exist yet. So that manuscript is helping to kick us into that critical phase where we actually have something to look at and say, this is maybe C-, B+ work. I can shift this a little bit. So I had to remove some pieces. And then there's a whole other process that I won't go into detail, but we could talk about later called Kill Your Darlings, which is a fun literary concept I did not know about until I started writing a book.
So when you are writing a book, the first thing you actually do is write a manuscript, and then writing the book comes much later.
Yeah. So the manuscript is really just getting all of it out in process, because the danger is you come up with a really, really well edited 7th version of your introduction, and that is not a book. But that's what happens to a lot of people when you step into it and you're like, oh, I'll just go back and reread it before I step into the next thing. Most of us need to get it all out on paper without any revision the first time around. And that manuscript is really just the getting it all out there first step.
As I stated earlier, Matt Ley is an author. He just recently finished his book. So make sure you guys stick around, and he is going to tell you. And I feel like it's going to be breaking news on the podcast. Have you told anyone else how to get your book, how to order and purchase your book yet?
No, not yet.
Oh, that's going to be breaking news on the podcast. Thank you for that, Matt. Thank you. Is it hard to write a manuscript that eventually leads into a book? Like, is that whole process hard? It sounds like a lot to me.
Yeah, and I will say, like, there are going to be people that it's not as hard to do. But I would say for the vast majority, you're going to need a partner along the way. And that maybe could be a professional. I'm in a professional program. That's how I did my book. But just having someone that's either a reader or a pusher of you to move on to the next thing. Mine's called a developmental editor. In fact, I've had like 6 different editors through the process. And so the developmental editor was the manuscript creation editor. Her job was just to push me to say, this chapter was good. This chapter was terrible. Doesn't matter. Write the next one. You don't get to go back and do anything. You just got to do it. The other part that the whole writing process was a learning piece for me. And in fact, it's something I actually reference. I reference the writing process in the book. So it's a little bit meta, but it's energy intensive for me to write. I found that I cannot write more than 3 hours a day. If I write more than 3 hours a day, pretty much everything after that 180-minute mark is just going to get deleted the next day. It's not good writing. So I actually have to be very, very intentional about managing my time. That if I'm going to, you can't skip a day for me. Like if I skip a day, I can't make it up the next day. And if I get busy for 4 days, it's not like I can power through a weekend. My weekend will still have just 6 hours of writing because it's energy intensive for me. Some people, they find it energy giving. It's a life-giving experience. They're okay with that. The interesting thing though, another meta concept for my book that I call fulfillment ROI is I think of fulfillment as basically an exchange of the energy we invest in something and the value it produces for us. So you might think, oh, geez, Matt's just describing writing as a really energy intensive event. He can only do 3 hours a day. It must be a drudgery. It must be terrible. It must be just soul sucking to get through it. It's actually, I found out to the opposite, because the process of understanding my ideas, being able to articulate them, and the excitement of getting it out in the world so I can have conversations with people and learn all the things I didn't know when I actually wrote the book is so life-giving and fulfilling for me because I see the purpose, I see the value. So even though it's a high energy intensive thing for me, I'm finding it a very fulfilling experience to have gone through the writing process because I see the value that's coming on the other side of it.
How did you figure out that I need 3 hours a day to write my book? How did you figure out I cannot skip days with writing my book? Like, how did you figure that out? Did one of your editors like point that out to you, or was that something that you realized yourself?
Trial and error, to be honest. Like I put myself out there and I had some busy weeks and I'd be like, I'll just get to it later. And I went down to the basement. I even took a week where I went, 3 days where I went away from the house and the kids, my wife, and it's like, I'm just going to focus on writing. And that was actually where it really drove home. It didn't matter how perfect I set up my space. Roughly 3 hours in, I was done. Like I just could not write anymore. And so I started recognizing the signals of this is what it looks like and this is what it feels like. These are my triggers when I'm getting to the edge of my energy capacity for this activity. So I need to build this in. And what I ended up needing to do is, if I'm going to do a heavy writing day, I need to know I'm building in something that's a very light energy lift, but a high value proposition. So playing a game with my kids is super fun. Like I love it. So I know I need a game day with my kids, or we watch some Bluey, which is just like one of my favorite shows of all time.
I love Bluey.
And so I know I need that built into my day if I'm going to do a heavy writing day, because it's not that I don't want to do anything and just stare at a wall. That doesn't feed me. What I need are activities that feed me because I'm depleted. So I'm depleted now. I need a feeding activity. That means I need to engage in something that actually fills my tank.
Would you, and I know we're speaking personally of your experience, but would you advise that for other people who are going through the book writing process? Because that sounds like an amazing way to maybe just step back from the writing and the constant reading to just release and relax and let go and then come back better and stronger.
Yeah, I mean, I would say take like a full Saturday or a Sunday or a day where you can dedicate yourself totally to the activity and you feel like you've got stuff to write about. So you aren't sitting trying to figure it out as well. And then just put your time in. How do you feel? And if you're a natural journaler or something that where you've done writing as part of a routine for you, this might be a little bit less of a drain, but just take that day and just use it as an example, a test, and be like, oh, this after 6 hours, I could write all day. I could write 25 hours a day if I had them. You learn that about yourself, and then you get to manage your energy as you see fit. Some people, I have what I call a power hour every morning when I'm writing, 5:15 to 6:15. Everyone else is asleep except for my wife, who's probably up running on a treadmill somewhere. I'm writing for an hour, because I know that that's a dedicated time and it puts me on the right foot. It's kind of like my equivalent of making the bed. I got something done so that the rest of my day falls into place. Or maybe you're a creative writer. Like, you want to get to the end of the day, everything else is processed. You don't have to worry about something coming in, and then you can put your time in. So I'd say do a day to test how much you can do in a day, and then figure out what portion or time in the day. Maybe you're an hour over lunch. That's your time to break away. But just learn your rhythms, and then set up a schedule and a system to maximize those.
When do you think would be the best time to figure that process out? Would it be before you start writing the book, once you've started writing a book, or is there even a timeline?
I mean, I'd say the earlier the better, but the thing is also there are different phases. There's heavy conceptualization phases and there's heavy production phases. There were points where I went in and said, shoot, how am I going to do this next portion of the book? And I wouldn't write a word for 4 days, but I'm happy with thinking. So I could do this 8, 10, 12 hours a day, and I'm in my element. So those days I would do a lot of either whiteboarding or maybe some note taking, or I just take walks and I'd talk internally, like what makes sense for the next piece, and I'd work it through. So those were heavy sort of contemplation days before I would hit production. So I would say there's 2 different pieces. Like, what are you going to write? And then actually going through, because that's the part that was draining me, is once I had the idea, that's when the clock would tick for the 3 hours. It's putting it on paper, coming up with a dialogue. If I'm having 2 people talk with each other, how do I word this concept? Oh man. One thing I'll throw it as an aside for later in the writing process that I wish I would have done earlier. Read it out loud to yourself.
Yes.
In a room. It feels weird. I'll tell you that, especially when I was at the end. The last thing for my book was reading the entire manuscript, which is 160 word pages, out loud 3 times in a row. So luckily I did that and was able to save my voice for some other things I did afterwards. But it's amazing. It sounds different when you read it out loud. And you catch some verbal tics that you actually have, or written tics that you write in there. So that's a practice I wish I would have done earlier to help with the process.
And I am shaking my head feverishly because I am an avid reader, which is something I told you about initially when we first spoke. I love to read. And that was something that I picked up on maybe in high school, that when you read out loud, whether it's a book or a newspaper, I mean, if those are still in existence, anything that you are reading, even if you're doing like a quiz or a test, if you read it out loud, it sounds completely different than when you read it silently. And you pick up on grammatical errors, run-on sentences, that comma shouldn't be there. Like, you pick up on so many different things when you read it out loud to yourself as opposed to reading it silently. So I know I'm not a writer at all. I'm a reader, and that is exactly true. That is exactly true. So 2 questions here, Matt. Number 1, why did you want to write a book? And the second question is, why do you think people would want to write a book?
Yeah, so I wrote a book for kind of 2 reasons. I'll just claim the first one was it's kind of like a calling card. Like, I'm not a great cold marketing person, in the sense of I'm not wired to be disruptive. I don't like to interrupt people in the flow of what they're doing. But if people want to have a conversation, like I love talking to people about stuff they care about. So the book kind of was ideally it's a way for people to read about stuff that I'm really passionate about, wanting to work with people on. Then if they like it, we can have a deeper conversation about possibly partnering together. 2, I would run into people that would be like, oh, that sounds really interesting. And we'd have maybe a 30, 45-minute conversation. I was like, I don't have time to go into the depth of whatever it is they're talking about. So it was honestly like a space of like, well, if you really are interested in it, check out the book, because it's going to have everything that you're talking about, plus a ton more. And if you can handle it from there, please, like, go with it. Because I'm a big fan of, I think helping people is kind of a 3-step process. You got to know what door you're looking for, the keys to unlock it, and you got to walk through it. So I'm a fan of keys for frees. Like, I'm going to give people keys. So if you know what door you're going to and you're comfortable walking through it yourself, I want to give you the keys. That's the stuff you give away for free, because those are the people that don't actually need a lot of help to get where they're going. And you're creating so much value just by giving them the key to unlock that door. There are people out there that probably have the key, but they're not sure what door it goes into. So helping them select the door, that's a partnership. And then helping people that are like, I'm a little bit nervous, I don't know if I want to walk through this door. That's where you make the biggest impact to help people. So I want to kind of sift through. The book is a way to say, if you can do this on your own, and really all you need is a key to unlock it, and then you can do it, buy the book for $10, $15, whatever it ends up being priced at, and go solve your problem and create some impact. So it's a value multiplier for me. And that allows me to be efficient to work with the people that truly need the support.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about your book. We don't want any spoilers here. So tell us a little bit about your book, and then tell us where we can go and purchase your book.
Yeah. And then after that, I'm going to circle back to your second question that I didn't get to about why people would write a book. But my book is called Manage Your Gaps, Reclaiming the Awesomeness of Management. And as I mentioned, kind of my driving thing is fulfillment ROI. Is I want people to feel fulfilled. And that's where you have good energy exchange for value. Working with organizations as a consultant, strategy consultant, management consultant, however you want to label me, as a coach, management is one of those spaces that, one, it has a lot of opportunity to either be a blocker or a multiplier of the value that people receive and perceive in an organization. And its job should be optimizing and activating the energy ability of the organization. And so it's really a pass-through to make the organization run really well. One of the things I talk about in the book is that managers are really like your culture champions. So they are going to live out a culture that may agree with the culture that you have written down, or it may not. But the culture they live out is going to be the culture your people experience. So how do you value managers? How do you value management? How do you articulate that into your organization? If you can do that in a way that resonates with who you want to be as an organization, that creates a much more fulfilling experience for people in a rippling effect that impacts so many. So I've been drawn to that space because I think it's, I call management one of the most over-leveraged and underutilized areas of business.
I agree.
So I wanted people to be like, hey, management's awesome. And managers can be awesome if we just give them the opportunity to be. So that I wrote the book to help people find more fulfilling experiences, both as managers and being managed in organizations.
And if I could just hop in there, I know you're going to, tell us where to purchase your book, which is going to be breaking news here on the podcast. But if I can hop in there and say, I totally agree with everything that you said, but I also feel like when people acknowledge the input, the importance of managers, that also uplifts the managers and makes them feel worthy, makes them feel needed, makes them feel important within the organization. And when you do that for a manager, you have no worries about how your organization is going to run, because they are going to make sure that your organization runs as you would have it, and even increase the organizational capacity.
Yeah, amen. Like two of the statements that I talk about in the book that I kind of unpack is that management is not the JV league for leadership, and management is also not a gold star for tenure or rock star individual contribution. It's a separate element of a three-legged stool that helps your organization stabilize. And if you don't treat it as such, and you treat it as some level in relationship to the other two, you take away its power to create impact. And so what we need to do is, part of it is tease apart, how come managers aren't leaders? Like, why don't people go around and say, hey, everyone can be a manager? Like, everyone should be a manager. No, we leave that for the heroes, right? We leave that for the leaders. We leave that for the value producers, the contributors. Managers don't have the vision. Managers don't create the value. So, like, why do we even have this role? And the book pretty much takes that question on and says, well, because managers are awesome, and here's why. And
yes.
Join me for a 150-page fun experience of figuring out why management is awesome.
Yes. Yes. And if you want to find out how managers are awesome and how to manage your gaps, where can we get that book from, Matt?
Easiest place is the general, like Amazon or Goodreads. You can also check it out on my website, flipthescript.io. Currently out in paperback and hardcover, but also will be released as an audiobook. You actually can get it as an ebook as well, but the audiobook is going to come out a little bit later.
Excellent. Okay, so if you want to purchase Manage Your Gaps, which I highly suggest that you do, and yes, I am doing a shameless plug. Go to Amazon.com or flipthescript.io to purchase that book. Okay, so let's go back to the second question. Why do you think people would want to write a book?
Yeah, and I'm going to answer two. I'm going to answer, why do you think people want to write a book, and why do I think people should write a book? Because I think those are related but different. Why people want to write a book? I mean, a book is a communication channel. It's a communication channel where you feel like you've got something to share, but you're looking for a larger audience. So it's like a one-to-many communication direction. That's sort of when you feel like you have a message that it's hard for people to get access to, that you want to stay consistent so that people can see it and interact with it, so it doesn't get lost in your LinkedIn or Facebook posts, or even an article that you wrote on there. In the mass social media onslaught that we get on a regular basis, a book becomes a pillar. It becomes a space and time where you can, in a sense, plant your flag and say, here's a concept that I think is really interesting and it's worthy of conversation. And you hold that space. So I see books as holding a space for a particular type of conversation. Why I think people should write a book is in part because of that, to plant that flag and hold that space. But also, they say, if you really want to know if you understand a topic, become a teacher. Like, learning to teach a topic is how you really learn whether you know the topic. I think writing a book on a topic is the next phase beyond that, because you have to articulate a long form explanation that fits all the pieces together. And one of the ways when I talk about the book, I've got two things. I talk about what are the foundations, what is like the sub-basement, like what are the concepts that absolutely, even if they're complicated, need to be understood because everything else is built on this. And then two, how tall do I want my book to be? Because there are some concepts that I've been doing this for decades that I'll call like a 7th floor concept. And if I pop a 7th floor concept into a 3-story book, that's going to be too far. There's too much building that has to go on for someone to articulate that in. I had to do a lot of work, and I referenced it at the beginning, called Kill Your Darlings, which is a literary concept where it's like you find something that's like, oh, I wrote this so beautifully. This is a perfect little concept, but it doesn't fit. Like, for me, I would say this is a 7th floor concept. This is something that is really cool, but I got to pull it out because it's too much cognitive load, too much cognitive lift. So I had to think through what is a 1st floor, 2nd floor, 3rd floor concept. So that logical iteration of, if someone were going to come into this new, that makes my ability to teach it, to share it, to work with organizations to be like, oh, you've got this foundation already. Now we can start building here. So instead of just throwing spaghetti against the wall, I'm helping them put things in the right order. So writing a book, if you have a concept that you really want to get into the world, this ideally will help you put it into an order so that you can help share it with people in a sort of format and a method that they actually can consume it in that order.
When you're writing a book, do you have to have in mind, and I feel like the answer is going to be yes, but I'm going to ask the professional. When you're writing a book, do you have to have in mind what level or what floor that you're writing that book for? So I'm writing this for the beginner, or I'm writing this for the 7th floor, the expert in this field.
Yeah, I think you have an idea when you start, but it's getting into the nuance. Like there's points where I'm like, oh, this is probably a fourth story item. I would cut that because as I'm too into the weeds. If I'm because I'm writing this book for people that are just understanding like what is management about. So my entry point is very much like the beginner or the manager who's in the world that's I have no idea what I signed up for, because one of the things I talk about is there's no such thing as a corporate ladder. We shift lanes. Like when you move from individual contributor to manager, you don't climb a rung, you shift. It's a different set of rules as to what success looks like for you. Just the same thing when you move from manager to leader. And so those shifts helping you understand what that is, there's a lot that's already going on in your head. I wanted you just to have hooks to get into it. I didn't want to make it super deep. But as a writer that maybe there's a version 2 of this book, I would have to know that, I believe, up front, at least where am I shooting for? And one of the, I would say, best examples before you get started is even before you write, sit down and who are your like character stories? Like who are the 2 or 3 people that you can envision? Give them names, give them a history, tell it. I had 3 people that I wrote to, and one was a leader, one was a manager, and was a small business owner. And I kept reading the chapters thinking about how would Chris, Claire, and Connor respond to any of the things that I was coming with. So Connor's my small business owner. And I finished writing a chapter. Would Connor get what Connor needs out of this chapter to help him in his work? Would Claire, as a leader, get what Claire needs out of this chapter to help her with her work? That was like user stories really, really helped me to get into it and be like, Claire and Connor got this, but Chris didn't get anything out of this chapter. What am I missing? And maybe this is just in the Chris chapter, and maybe it's part of the book that needs to flow. And like I could say, Chris is the world. We'll just not get a lot out of it, but it needs to fit for the Claire and Connor. That was super helpful, was just having those user stories.
Are your names in your book actually Chris, Connor, and Claire, all C's?
No, but for whatever reason, the letter C is like my alliteration go-to. So a lot of well, in fact, there is a concept in the book called the 4 C's, but it is not Chris, Claire, Connor, and someone else. That's just seems to be my letter, but they're not named in the book at all. That was just for me as I was going through it. Yes. I have user profiles created for these people and their histories and what they used to do and what they do outside of work and why they want to read a book. So
okay. Well, I love it. I love the C's, of course. Yeah. Crystal, I love the C's. When should people decide on a title for their book? I feel like the title, and I could be wrong here, but I feel like the title is the most important part because it catches the reader, it catches the potential buyer. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's crucial. That is for sure. It's definitely the thing that's going to the title and the cover page. It's going to be everyone's first thing they see when they see this book. Coming up with it, mine, I'll be honest. Like before I even started writing the book, this was my title, and my process was the center of my book is all around this management model that I created called EPIC, which stands for Environment, Performance, Identity, and Communication. So it's the what, the who, and the how of management. So that's how you do management as an activity. I thought the book was all going to be about that. And then I recognized that if I just did that, I'm missing 2 other gaps. So I'd say there's 3 gaps to management: how we understand it at the strategic level, which is organizational design and vision; how we understand it at the tactical level, which is the activity of management; and how we understand it at the operational level, which is answering the question, if teamwork makes the dream work, what makes the team work? Understanding how management plays into the formula for that. Mm. And so my working title when I do presentations was Epic Management, Reclaiming the Awesomeness of Management. And people just love the subtitle of that. So when I was like, oh, there's actually 3 gaps. Well, it's about management, so manage your gaps made sense. And I just kept the subtitle from all of my presentations. And that was before I wrote word 1 of the book. But I've worked with some other authors through the program that there's either the topic shifted after they started writing. So I'd say hold to it, have something to start with, but hold loosely. So have a starting point, but hold loosely to it and let the book inform you on what it's trying to say.
Okay. Okay. How do you know how many chapters a book should be?
Yeah, and that ebbs and flows. I'll tell you one of the things is if you're over 60,000 words, it's going to cost you more money because the book is going to be longer. So that becomes like your kind of break point, as well as 3,500 to 5,000 words is a good chapter length, because that one of the things you want to do is in the chapter, like it has a thesis. Like, what is it? What are you trying to get people to understand by the end of this space? And if you start doing it over 5,000 words, roughly that's 300 words per page in a normal book, you're looking at, this is getting close to, be somewhere around almost 18 pages of material. That starts to get a little long because we just seem to be wired when we read a book that we want to get to the end of the chapter. And I know I've done it. Like, I've been reading in a book, I'm like kind of tired, and oh man, there's 8 pages left in this chapter.
Yes. Yes.
I slog my way through most of the time because I just got to get to the end of the chapter before I can say I'm done reading for this session. So keeping the chapters tight is one of the things that we learn. So like, try not to get over 5,000 words, but let's say you're working at 3,500 to 5,000 words, roughly between, like they say, 35,000 to 60,000 words. Like if you're under 35,000, then you don't really have enough meat there. So you're looking somewhere between 10 and 20 chapters. And then for me, I did concepts. So like, I've got 3 gaps. Well, what do I need people to understand to truly get the gap? And then I would write each of those concepts down. And in fact, I ended up, by the end of the book, I had to break out and create 2 extra chapters because the content was getting close to that. Like, I had a couple 7,500 word chapters. So learning how to break that out. So that it's really figuring out what are the starting and stopping points. But I'd say you're going to be looking, you have your introduction, you have your conclusion, sum it all up, but everything in between, probably 12 to mine's 19 chapters, but between 12 and 20, I would say, is where you just end up.
And how do you know? And I know you said that each chapter should be roughly 3,500 to 5,000 words. How did you come up with that number?
That was part of the program. I went through a program called Manuscripts, and then so they shared the numbers. But then honestly, I went and read the material that I had written based on that word count and said, how does this feel? And something that was like 2,500 words felt like a supplement. Something that was over 5,000 words felt like a slog to get to the end. And that can ebb and flow. Like, if you have a really good story and you're sharing some dialogue and people are getting involved, because that's one of the other pieces is people think in story. We want to read in story. And if we don't include story into the book, it's difficult. And that was actually one of my struggle points early on, because I was in the mindset of, this is just like my presentations, right? So I'm going to take all the content that I present in my half-day, 2-day presentations, and I'm just going to put it in book form. This is going to be simple. And what I realized is that I had all the content, but when I present, the audience brings the context. So I start the conversation with my content. They bring their context, and the stories, which is the meaning making of the content, comes from the 2 of those combining. Writing the book, there was no context. And so I just started throwing content on paper, and my poor editor had to read through that and be like, you just shared 15 things with me. Guess how many of them I remember? 0.
Oh my goodness.
And it's hard. Like, I got to a point where I was like, I don't know, do I need a different editor? Maybe this isn't a good relationship. Like, I'm crying in the corner of my shower. Like, I thought these things were cool. And it finally took me a while to realize that I had to create the context to plug in the content. That was the hardest part for me into the writing process, was like, how do I craft a story from my experiences where this worked to help people understand it, but still do that in a logical way so that they're not getting concept 3 and then we're going back to concept 1, and then we're how do I help it build but write a narrative that is more story based? in that process. And that took some time. So really collecting stories of where this stuff actually has, think of it as like the meaning making portion of it. It's like content means nothing unless it actually has a context in which to, like seeds, doesn't matter how amazing, like the thing is, oh, I love corn, I've got corn seeds. If you don't have soil, if you don't have context to plant it into, and you don't have good soil that is rich in nutrients and has everything to help it grow, that seed's just going to be a seed and it's not going to help anybody. So really understanding how to tell the stories to bring those two things together was what I think, if the book is good and people enjoy reading it, it's the process that I got pushed into to really get better at writing stories to share the content.
The stories, the concept, the context, the stories, is all of that combined what makes it a visual for the reader? So as we're reading, like we can see it in our minds. Does that equal to what you're trying to do in the end?
Yeah. And that's part of it, is like you want to paint that visual, because when you're learning, part of that learning is, like I mentioned earlier, is like the cognitive load, is we have to construct the space. So if you think about it, like I said, there's a 3-story building, right, that I'm trying to build as my book. Well, that means if you don't have any concept of this building at all, in your mind, you have to put in the girders, like the I-beams and all of it, before you can even put the furniture in the room. But if I can tell some story to give you a context, like how things look, that you don't have to do that for yourself. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, there's just 2 people sitting on a couch. They're having a conversation. I've got the visual already. And then I can focus my energy in consuming what's going on in between, versus Matt throws a bunch of concepts at me and I've got to be like, okay, well, I put this one on this shelf, and it just feels really cluttered. I think of the storytelling as setting up the room that we're going to have the conversation in. And that does, like, just like you said, in much shorter amount of time than I did, it gives you the visual to help people have that conversation in their own head.
Okay. So let's talk about naming of the chapters. I have read several books where there's no names of the chapters. It's just like chapter 9, chapter 10, chapter 11. And then there's books where there's names to each of the chapters. How do you know which lane to go down? Should you name your chapters? Should you not name your chapters? And if you name your chapters, how do you know what to name them?
Yeah, I think for me, I had to name the chapters, because that became sort of like the pithiest version of the thesis statement for me, was the name of the chapter. Like, what are people going to get here? And then also, I wanted it to be something that hopefully would be, memorable. Like my sections are called like Gap 1, strategic. That's not super memorable. But some of my chapters, like I've got a chapter called Managers Are Zero Value Add. That's probably going to stick in somebody's brain. It's like, wait a minute, this guy's writing about management being awesome, and now he's saying management zero value add. I want to know what that's about. And so that was, for me, trying to capture the concept. So I felt like I really had to name the chapters. Honestly, I like books that do, because I read through the table of contents as a real quick start of like, okay, what's the flow going on here? And it's like, okay, well, they've got 19 chapters of blank. Like, I wish I had a little bit more of a guide before I stepped into this. It's just, I feel like it's a quick girdering of the building for me before I step into it.
Do you have to read a lot, or do you have to love to read in order to be a good writer?
I don't know. I don't think you have to be, but I will say that writing has shifted the way that I read, and I became a better reader through writing. And then because I was a better reader, I think I became a better writer, because I would see more consciously what was and wasn't working in other people's writing for me. Mm-hmm. I was actually gifted a book by somebody early in my writing process, when I was getting the feedback from the editor, you don't tell enough stories. It's all content. Like, you got to get some stories in here. Someone gifted me a book that was very, very heavy in content and not very much story. And I remember being like, this is very, very difficult. Like, I like these concepts. I'm engaged with the concepts, but I have to work so hard to be like the flow. It's almost like I was swimming against the current versus with the current. And I think that's a difference. When you put stories into it, people might want to swim in your river, but you're helping them swim with the current versus against it. That works for me.
Yes, yes. Okay, how do you pick the cover of your book? But before you answer that, because I just had a question pop in my mind. So you said that reading made you a better writer. Is it because you could understand where the writer was coming from, or you could understand like all of the work that was put into writing that book? What do you feel like made you become a better writer because of the reading?
I think it's just repetition of examples. Like I was reading with a much more conscious lens, and I would see like, oh, I see what you're trying to do here. You're instilling some humor. You're telling some stories. I probably would have put those concepts in a different order. Or, wow, I got to the end of this chapter. I didn't even realize it. One of the things my current editor for revisions was telling me when I was doing my revisions was, think of the cars going 55 miles an hour. And when you read it out loud, when do you feel like you hit speed bumps? And I could tell when writers were writing and hitting speed bumps because I was experiencing it. And I would see, why was I hitting a speed bump? And be like, oh, this paragraph is just really wordy. They use a lot of technical jargon. They jumped really quick from topic to topic. Just whatever it ended up being is like, that's what does that. So I had just a lot of examples of what the speed bumps were in their road, so that when I was writing, be like, okay, I got to make sure I don't do that. So that was pretty much it.
Now, back to the original question. How do you pick the cover of your book? Which I think is, we discussed that a little bit earlier, one of the most important aspects of the book. How do you pick that? How do you know this is the cover? This is it?
Yeah, so it's weird. I can do a PowerPoint presentation and I'll come up with graphics and animations, and I love to display the concepts, but graphic design, my wife could change the colors of the walls in our house, all of them, and I would walk in the next day and I would be totally oblivious to it. Like, I just don't see that stuff very well. So I needed help. And luckily my program, part of it is they help you with the graphic design side of it. Then also one of the cool things with writing the book is through this program is you create an author community. It's like people that are interested in your topic and you prior to the book going out in the world. They've been a wellspring of information, of feedback on chapters that I'm writing, because that also helps me out of my echo chamber of self-doubt when I'm like, is this really any good? Maybe I should just stop and go hide in a corner. And they also helped with picking the design. So I got multiple designs. I shared them with the community, and looking at what people said resonated with them and why helped me, with some audience feedback. So crowdsourcing really helps. So if you're thinking about that and you have a couple designs and you don't have a system like this set up, share it on social media. Just say, hey, I've got 3 different options. What do people think of 1, 2, and 3? So give them something to look at. And from the feedback, you could probably make a pretty good choice on that.
Is community important when writing a book? Do you need that community to help you write a book?
I would say for sure I did. And I would anticipate that most people would find that extremely beneficial. I've had people from very different walks of life read through it, from people that experience multiple managers, that are new managers, that work in small businesses, that work in large corporate environments, that are in sort of like nonprofit where management really isn't a concept in what they do the same way it is in a corporate space. Are they finding value? Where are they hitting roadblocks? Where is this falling flat? And I would just kept being open to feedback. And there are significant changes in the book based on that feedback that I do not believe I would have had in there had I not shared it with other people. So I'd say the earlier you can share it, the better off you're going to be. You might need a little thicker skin early on. It's gonna some of those are going to be painful, because you want to find people that are willing to care about you enough to be candid with that feedback.
That's what I was thinking. You really have to be vulnerable to share your writing material.
Yeah, I will say if you want a visceral reaction, it's like literally getting in front of people that opinion you care about, totally naked, and asking, "Do I have any blemishes?" It feels just like that. It's that like you've got nothing to hide behind. Like this is you.
Yes.
Oh, and if you can get comfortable with that though, so like that's another reason to write the book is just I feel so much more confident in the topic. And like I said at the very beginning, I'm not really wired to be disruptive, but I see the power of this now because I've experienced it with people, not just from the presentation, but from the early heavy pen readers, like the author community. And I've listened to some of that feedback and gotten through some like, I don't know, this doesn't make it helps you to be better at having the conversation. So you can actually provide value for people. So
Yeah. Yeah. Is it expensive to write a book?
well, there's two things. There's time and there's finances. My program like was in the tens of thousands of dollars to go all the way through it.
Okay.
I know that I needed that. If I would have been on my own, I would have been that 17th revision of the introduction and maybe the first section. I needed a group to really push me along. And the feedback I've gotten from them is invaluable. So for me, that investment was worth it and kind of a requirement for how I'm wired. If you're a natural writer and you've got that community built up and you've got some of these steps down, then it really just becomes time. On the time side, even with this program, I mean, I started writing this book in June last year, and it's been almost like a little over a year of full-time commitment
Yes.
to get it out into the world. And that's when I've shared that with people, they're like, "Oh, wow, that's really fast." So you should be looking at this is like a 1 to 2 year process if you're serious about getting the book out there.
And I'm assuming that your program came with a publisher.
Yeah.
Okay, so what is a publisher and how do you know like if this is the right publisher for you?
Yeah, there's kind of so just like work with in-person, hybrid, and remote, we've kind of got three different types of publishing that I've become aware of in this. Like you can self-publish, which is like with everything like Amazon and all of that, you can just put your own book out there in the world, and they can actually be the back end publishing house for you. The benefits of that is you own all of the intellectual rights. You can do whatever you want. The downsides are you have to figure out all of those pieces for yourself and do all of the marketing those pieces. The traditional route of publishing is what you're doing is the publisher is purchasing the rights to the creative thing that you've done. So they own it, just like publisher, producer of musical content. They own the rights to that content once it's produced or published through them in the traditional sense. So the writer, case in point, interesting piece is like if I wanted to use a graphic from someone else's concept, that's like, oh, this really helps me make this point. I could write to the author, and if they went through a traditional publishing process, they would say, well, I don't actually own the rights to that. You have to ask my publisher to use it. So the publisher, the exchange is the author gets, paid for the rights of the thing that they created, but once that's done, the publishing house owns it. There is a hybrid, which is the type of program that I'm in, which you can think of the publisher more like a distributor. So they help you through the process, and that's in a sense why I'm paying the money up front is I will own all of my intellectual property when this thing is out in the world, and I can do with it what I want. But I get access to all of the expertise that a traditional publishing house would have for writing the manuscript, doing the marketing, getting it out into the world. And then since they become the distributor, and it's just, where's your risk portfolio? Do you want to invest the time and own all of the risk and not have to pay for any support and then just see what happens? Then self-publish. If you have a great idea and get it out in the world, and you just want to have minimal risk and you just want it out there, and from at that point on, you just don't care, probably traditional publishing. And then hybrid, if you're kind of somewhere in the middle, willing to put in some of the risk, but you would like some support. As to the question of what publisher to go with, that I didn't have to do as much because the program had the publishing on the back end. my understanding from other people who have gone through it is almost like you farm it out. You read about what type of portfolio a publishing company tends to put into the world, what they're looking to do. And nowadays you can read that on their websites and such. And then you reach out. If you're interested, you could also go the route of looking for a literary agent. They could help you find the publishing house. And at that point, you'd probably want a writing sample of the material to share with them. But that's kind of one of those, you need to have some writing out in the world to sort of showcase yourself before you can make that connection.
How do you know, and maybe the company that you're with helps with this, but how do you know how much to sell your book for?
That's then back to my MBA days, like that's just the marketing thing. Do you want to have a low price and a large volume, or do you want to have a higher price and a lower volume? And really, what are you trying to maximize for? Are you trying to maximize for reach? Or are you trying to maximize for profitability? That was part of the conversation with like, why are you writing in the first place? And like you asked me at the beginning, for me, this is kind of my calling card. So price point for the book, I'm more interested in a lower price point, larger consumption for people getting these ideas out there so that it ideally can help them. But for some people, it's they're trying to maximize to that highest price point people are willing to pay for the book so that you can maximize the profits on the back end. So it just really depends on the individual and what you're willing to kind of put out there.
Okay. What is an editor? I know you stated earlier that you said you had like 3 or 4 editors.
I had 1, 2, 3, 4 official, well, we'll call it 5 editors. So okay. I had but I believe it was called a positional editor, was my first editor. And that was just, why are you writing the book? What do you want to get across? And let's lay out chapters through those concepts. So that was just getting the overview of what's the purpose of the book, what's the general structure of the book. And then I moved into the developmental editor, which is saying, okay, that's your structure, now write. And that was the person who was telling me, you put too much content, not enough story, but you can't do anything about it. Write the next chapter, write stories in that one. And then just they were pushing you to get the manuscript done. Then I had a structural editor that went through and read it from beginning to end to say, okay, everything you wrote, does it fit into an actual narrative, or are there gaps, overlaps? Would I recommend cutting this particular piece? So they go for the whole flow. And then I went into revisions editing, which is another whole process of going through the manuscript. And that's the part where I said I cut 30,000 words to write 35,000 more, because I'd read something and be like, oh, that wasn't really that good. Especially the earlier on stuff, it took a lot more. And now the last piece is copy editing, which is just full read through to put it together. And then you go to typesetting, which is just putting it into book format, which wouldn't necessarily be an editing piece. So was that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different types of editors all looking at particular things within the process.
Does everyone who is writing your manuscript first that eventually leads into writing your book need or should have 5 editors like that?
No, I don't think it's a requirement. It was definitely a benefit. And I don't know if I would have I don't think I would have gotten rid of any of them. I found value in each one of those phases because they were looking at it from different lenses. It's kind of like your forest editor, your tree editor. Now back to a different forest editor, different tree editor at the different phases. And now if you're doing it on your own, I mean, I think just having ideally like either someone who's co-writing the book with you that could be a feedback person, or someone that's walking the journey with you that you can kind of help, that is willing to wear those hats. I think you could do that with one person.
Okay.
It would be really hard to do it all by yourself. That would be my guess.
Yes. Do the books that are placed in brick and mortar stores, I know a lot of places now, people buy their books online. That's like 99% of where I buy my books are online. And of course, your book, as you stated earlier, Manage the Gaps. You can also purchase that online, Amazon.com and flipthescripts.io if you want to purchase Matt's book. But for the books that are in the brick and mortar buildings, do those bookstores pay you to sell your book in their stores?
That one I'm not 100% sure on how that works, because I've just gone with the virtual online. I've done a couple of, go to small bookstores when I'm in an area for like traveling for consulting, just to say, hey, I've got a book out. I can buy author's copies at a much reduced rate, and then I could sell them on my own out there. But as to like getting into the brick and mortar stores, I think you can do both. Like they take all the risk and they buy the books, and then they can sell them for whatever price they want, or they can do it on consignment. But I haven't gone down that route just yet, since this is the reveal of the book being out in the world. I'm figuring out the rest of it. Also, it's flip the script with no S at the S. And
okay, let me fix that.
Yeah.
What? I forgot my question. Hold on, give me a second here. No. Okay, there it is. What is your personal intention being an author and in this space of writing a book?
Trigger the conversations. Like, I'm a big believer that, like, I love assessments kind of in the same space as what I love about assessments is they're not meant to pigeonhole people. They're descriptive, not prescriptive. They're the start of a conversation, not the end of it. But they're a conversation that they give us a language set that we didn't have before. My hope is that the book does the same thing. It gives people a language set to talk about management in a way that they may not have been able to articulate. Or maybe they thought about it, but it's kind of easier. Like, honestly, sometimes when I'm hired as a consultant, my job is to say what people have already been saying to the company, but I'm the person that they can either fire or say, hey, I didn't say it. They said it. The book does the same thing. It kicks off the conversation without someone feeling like they have to own the premise. The book owns the premise. They can do with it what they want.
I consider you, Matt Ley, an author. Do you consider yourself an author?
Oh, that's a great question. It's a kind of the same thing of like, how long do you have to run and how many races before you consider yourself a runner? Or
yes.
Me, I don't know. I guess in different ways, I never considered myself a writer. And in fact, I would say writing is my least favorite communication style. I'm a conversationalist. I want to just talk to people. But I recognized as a type of channel, I could never have enough conversations to make the impact I wanted to see. So I needed to step into a space that was outside my norm. So I would say it was never an intention on my path, or it was never a bucket list item to write a book or to be an author. But I guess it's sort of one of those, after you graduate from college, you may not feel like a graduate, but you technically are. So a book's out in the world. I guess I'm technically an author, even though I don't necessarily feel like a writer.
Wow. I cannot believe that. You dropped so many things that I did not realize, that writing is not your favorite form of communication. I would have, and that's just me assuming, and I know what they say about people assume, but it's me assuming that since you wrote a book, obviously you love to write. And since you wrote a book, obviously you are an author. You consider yourself an author.
So fun side story on that. When I was in college, I argued with at least a half dozen professors about writing papers for class. I was like, this is the poorest communication channel for what you're trying to measure. A paper is for mass consumption of multiple people. It's a one-to-many. You're measuring my ability to understand this topic on a one-to-one. Like maybe a TA is going to read this alongside of you. So this is a 1-to-2. That's called a conversation. We should have a conversation about a topic, not write papers. And that was in part because I just didn't want to write any papers.
Yeah.
But yeah, like I was trying to get away from writing as much as I possibly could as I was going through school.
And look at you now.
Look at me now. Yeah.
Look at you now. Let's talk about the emotional toll that writing a book takes on you. What was that journey like?
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, like the visceral piece of like standing naked in front of people. I think it's one of those, it was hard to remember now after going through the whole process. Calling myself an author now feels okay. But when I told people I was writing a book, when I was starting to write a book, so one, there was no book, and it felt like, man, I feel really uncomfortable, like almost like cocky, like, I've got something worth saying, I'm going to write a book. It felt really uncomfortable to claim that. Like, I felt the same thing when I got certified as a coach. Like, geez, like, I don't know. That imposter syndrome just kicks in so fast. And it was having some conversation partners and people that were willing to stand in my corner and just be like, to keep having the conversation, keep getting out there, that I could get past that initial bump. And then there's it was a second one phase for me, is the minute I was like, wait a minute, like there's something legitimately interesting to say here. Like this is a really important topic. I do not want to screw this up. And it reminded me, like, I was my path through life has been very circuitous. So like at one point I was a pastor, so I was leading a small church, and I would preach every week. And so I'd do sermons all the time. I'm an extemporaneous, like I said, conversation is my communication style. I'm an extemporaneous preacher, which means most of the time I'll read the text, I'll experience the week, and then I'll stand up in front of people with no script and I'll just talk for 12 to 13 minutes because I'm Lutheran and that's the exact amount of time we're supposed to preach, and that's it. Except for funerals. Funerals, I would write them word for word and I would read them from the pulpit, because that is the time where people are truly looking for the words of inspiration in this moment of grief. And I wanted to be as clear of a pain for the power that stands behind me. And I did not want to disrupt people's view of that. And I was really nervous that if I stood in front of them in an extemporaneous way, I would disrupt that flow and they would see me and not that which stands behind me. Mm-hmm. I felt very similar when I got to the end of the book. I don't want to screw this up by being a bad writer, because there's something really valuable about management that people are going to gain from reading this. If I suck at writing the story, they're not going to get the message. And it was a second level of like, I started holding myself to a really, really high standard of like, I got to tell really good stories. I got to go through this. That's why you read it multiple times, because the value was there. The gem had been uncovered. I did not want to be the barrier to people getting access to that.
Oh, okay. What about the physical toll? Is there a physical toll to writing a book?
I don't know if I would. I don't think I felt a physical toll. Like, yeah, maybe the closest thing is that because there's sometimes an emotional side of it, and I tend to be an emotional eater. So there was some late night snacking, which is just me staying up late and thinking about it. So that mm-hmm. have a positive effect on my overall health. Yeah. I'm also I love to walk and think through ideas. So I did quite a bit of walking during the midst of it. But yeah, I mean, outside of, like, I guess most of the time when people are writing, you're sitting down. So it definitely does tie you to a chair. I don't think any more than any type of other work, it had much of a physical toll for me.
I'm going to ask this question. It's probably horrible because you just released your book and you can get it on Amazon.com or Flip the Script, no S at the end, .io, and it's called Manage Your Gaps. Do people even still read books?
Yeah, and the vast majority of books that I consume are Audible. I still listen to books. Like, I'm an Audible audiobook consumer.
Okay.
But it's still a space that people, I think, and this is how I hope it continues to get used, is people read it in community. Like, I think books are really great, like book clubs, masterminds, mm-hmm. that type of space is, I think, one of the places that a book brings value. I mean, and so do all, like, media, like podcasts are fantastic, blog posts, just different ways to get the idea in front of you. The book is more of like a continuous journey through a larger topic to get you, I think, some deeper material to chew on. So if you find a book that's like, yeah, that's a topic we're struggling with, or that's a topic we have passion about, going through it, that's a great method. I mean, yeah, it's still, billions of dollars industry, people are still buying books. I'm hoping they're reading them, but I know at least they're buying them.
Yes, yes. And I know Oprah has a big hand in that. Her Oprah Book Club of the
Yeah.
month is like, yeah, I feel like it rejuvenized the whole buying books and reading books, especially during that time. Okay, so this next question is going to be directly leading into my next question. Is writing a book an addictive behavior?
Well, I would say that it's got me thinking differently, and it's actually the thought of potentially writing more. I don't know if I necessarily would write another book, but the thought of it isn't overwhelming. So maybe part of that's just the practice, but it's given me access to another form of communication that I don't think I would have used as much. So I write more than I was even before, like even in this time coming out from having finished the book. So I would say it's increased it. I don't know if it's, I'm gonna step that back a bit, and I think as a process for really understanding the concept, I think writing will become my go-to for that. So I've uncovered what I think is the value of it for myself, and so I don't know if I necessarily call it addictive, but it will be something that becomes more of my process.
So my second question to that, and I think maybe you partially answered it already, are you going to write a second book? And I feel like asking that question is like when people ask a woman who's just had a baby, are you going to have another baby? Like, I just had this one baby. But
That's exactly
really,
what jumped into my brain. It's like after we've had our kids, it's like people come in and say, "So, you think you're gonna have another one?" It's like, well, let's figure this one out first.
right.
Uh, I guess it would have to be two things. Like, I want to see what's the response to this book, and two, do I feel like I have another topic that needs a flag planted and a space created? And probably more reliant on that second one. Like if this book it tanks and no one reads it and all of that, honestly, my minimum amount of success is that I wrote the book and I can put it on 3 shelves, which is for one of my 3 kids. Like I just want to leave them something that they can read that dad wrote, that they don't even have to care about management, but it's, I won't be here forever. Like that's a piece of me that's in the world for them forever.
Yes.
That's it. Like that, I have hit my bar of success for writing this book. So really, it's, do I feel like there's another flag that needs to be planted to create some space for a conversation? If that are the case, I would probably like to co-write it. Honestly, I'd love to find someone that has another topic that they also have the passion around. I think that would make the process even more enjoyable because I'm just wired to be collaborative. Like writing with someone, I think would be a magnitude more enjoyable than writing by myself.
Okay, so I have a few more questions for you, Matt, and then I'm gonna let you go. Well, maybe like 4 more. Since you have written a book, I keep getting all these amazing,
Yeah,
or what I assume amazing questions in my head as we're doing
awesome.
this interview. Since you have written a book, are you more conscious of words and how you speak in the words that you put out into the universe?
I think I've always been pretty like that's something that I tend to bring most places, is being pretty conscious about the language we use and how we're using it. Um, and I would say that that's definitely even been heightened by the book. I mean, I got all the way through it, and I had 2 whole sections where I flipped the names of them because I realized I hadn't been using the language correctly in my own understanding of it. And I got called out by a couple of people. I was like, "Could you use these terms interchange?" It's kind of confusing. So it definitely has left me a little bit more humble to be like, even the terms that I think I've fully understood, um, making sure that we have a shared understanding as we step into the space.
Okay. And do you have a favorite author? And if so, who is that person and why?
Oh, well, I got a bunch of books out here on the shelf.
I see.
So I would say I think probably Louise Penny is my favorite author. She wrote I think it's Armand Gamache is the name of the detective series. It's like 15 books long, and her dialogue is just fantastic and insightful, and it's a detective mystery, and so she writes a really good story, but it's the dialogue between the personal interactions, and it just I find myself pausing and thinking a lot more like when I read her stuff, and so she's fantastic.
Okay. And my final question, my fourth question, my final question for you, Matt Ley. Who do you think would make a great guest on the podcast? But you have to help me get them on.
I know, like this. I knew this question was coming. Like this was the one that kept me up at night. Everything else, I feel I could answer on the fly, but narrowing down all the awesomeness in the world into just the next person.
Yes.
So, who made the top of my list is a dear friend, contact named Carlton Innes. He is. I met him through the coaching program that I've been in, and he's been my confidant and long-term like conversation partner through the book, through life, and all of that. And he's just a fantastic. He's got a program called the Ultimate Spark. That's part of his coaching program for helping people reignite like their passion. And I love the way he talks about energy and how energy flows into and supports what we do. And so I think that like when I talk about language sets, he brings that language set into how our energy shows up for us in a way that's pretty unique, and I really appreciate it. So I think he'd be a voice, and he's got his own podcast. He's got just a beautiful radio voice, so he's someone you could just listen to for hours, and it's all good.
Ooh, that'll be perfect for my Apple Podcast listeners.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Matt, for agreeing to do this podcast. I mean, this has been such an eye-opening, aha, I cannot believe it type podcast. And you have given me everything that I expect in a book. Everything. When I read a book, all the things that I expect in a book, you have given me in this podcast. I thank you so much.
It's blown by. It feels more like 60 seconds than 60 minutes. I will say, but for people that have made it all the way to the end, if they go to the website, flipthescript.io/MYG for manage your gaps/Crystal, they could download the introduction and the first section of the book to read for free, just to give them a little taste.
Matt, you did not.
I did.
Oh my God. Thank you so much. You are amazing. Okay, this is an authentic reaction, everyone, because I had no idea that he was doing that. Wow.
Yeah, keys for free. So if it's interesting and that's enough to help you get going, I hope you enjoy.
Absolutely. And make sure to send me that link. I'll put it in the description box below so people can definitely just click on it and go straight there.
Perfect.
Absolutely. Thank you again, Matthew. And thank you to all of my listeners, my viewers, my learners. You can get this podcast and all of my other podcasts on YouTube Podcasts and Apple Podcasts. And remember, you always have time to listen and learn on the go.